What the hell was Noam Chomsky thinking? The world's most influential left-wing public intellectual had a massive impact on me as a teenager, and I'm sure many of you as well. You know, he was someone who fearlessly exposed the horrors of American imperialism for decades. But Chomsky's been implicated in the hideous scandal involving the late paedophile Jeffrey Epstein. He struck up a friendship with him after Epstein had already been in prison for soliciting sex with a minor. He repeatedly spent time with him, including at Epstein's townhouse, his apartment, his ranch. Chomsky spent time with Steve Bannon, the far-right former chief strategist to Donald Trump, thanks to Epstein. There's a picture of them, you know, kind of being all jovial together. When Epstein came under scrutiny for allegations of sex trafficking in 2019, he asked Chomsky for advice on how to respond. And Chomsky said the following: "I've watched the horrible way you are being treated in the press and public. It's painful to say, but I think the best way to proceed is to ignore it. What the vultures dearly want is a public response, which then provides a public opening for an onslaught of venomous attacks, many from just publicity seekers or cranks of all sorts. That's particularly true now with the hysteria that has developed about abusive women, which has reached the point that even questioning a charge is a crime worse than murder." I mean, just disgusting, to be honest, and unforgivable. I mean, even if you know, those comments are outrageous, even if you just take it out the context of the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. I'm shocked and appalled personally to witness someone who was a hero to my younger self and someone a hero to those who believe in justice and a better world implicated in this outrageous scandal. But it is important not to shy away from difficult topics. I want to understand what the hell happened here. So I talked to the anthropologist Chris Knight, who has written about Chomsky for many decades, including the book Decoding Chomsky, to try and work out how this could possibly have happened. Now, Chris, you've been researching Noam Chomsky for decades. You've written a book on it. You've written lots of, including recent work, for example, on the revelations to do with the late paedophile Jeffrey Epstein. Now, many of us were absolutely shocked and appalled, baffled, if I'm honest, found the whole thing completely and utterly surreal. Peter Mandelson and Jeffrey Epstein, can imagine that. Prince Andrew and Jeffrey Epstein, can imagine that. Noam Chomsky, it just seemed like a kind of writer's room on a TV show had just taken a bizarre turn and randomly inserted a completely, you know, out there character who had nothing to do with that world in our heads into the whole scenario. It was just so shocking because I think people often associate Noam Chomsky with quite a high level of moral integrity. I mean, moral integrity is a huge part of certainly, you know, humanism in his work. What was your response when you saw those pictures of Noam Chomsky with this late paedophile? He spent all this time with people, you know, some of the most repulsive figures, you know, like Steve Bannon. And there's Noam Chomsky with Steve Bannon and Jeffrey Epstein. Well, what was your take when you first saw that?
With Steve Bannon and the two of them having a hug. And then a picture of Epstein and Noam on Epstein's private, you know, plane. It's absolutely mind-blowing and astonishing. So I suppose my reaction was astonishment. But on the other hand, I was very familiar with the fact that Noam has always led sort of two lives. I mean, he is the world's best known and most admired on the left dissident activist against the US military establishment, who has spent all his life, all his adult life, his career, working for the same US military establishment, whom he regarded as criminals, war criminals, many of them, of course, including describing some of these people he was working alongside as essentially Nazis, in the sense that they didn't seem to care how many millions of people would die if their designs for missiles and guidance systems ever came to, you know, to be used. So I was used to being sort of astonished at the people who would associate with, and not only associate with, but describe as his friends. So I'm just saying I kind of used to the two Chomskys, as I call them, So there's the Chomsky who spent his life fighting against the US military, the one who's been working his life in the pay of the US military. And it's not just me that's saying there's two Chomskys. An interviewer once asked him, what do the two Chomskys, the two versions of yourself, have to say to each other when they meet? And he said, well, they've got very little in common except a few things on the margins. And he described himself as having a brain with, like a computer with buffers in it, which enabled him to be sort of doing two completely different things at the same time on an airplane, for example. Just somehow he would just move between this Chomsky, the activist, and this other Chomsky, the scientist working for the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which of course is the Pentagon's university. So I was used to him associating with criminals, people he himself conceptualized as criminals. But of course, this was absolutely something else. I suppose I also felt a bit sorry for him as well, because I knew he was getting on a bit. He was sort of losing it a bit in some ways. I just say, for example, his whole theory sort of began falling apart around the turn of the century in the sense that people stopped believing in any of it. And he increasingly...
Just to be clear, his linguistic theories, it's interesting because so many people, of course, follow Noam Chomsky for his political theories. In the mass kind of popular sphere, very few know about his linguistic spheres these times. I mean,
that's the other very interesting thing. The people who are left-wing activists and know about his political writings, his views on, justice in the world and so on, they don't know anything at all because they don't know anything at all about his linguistics. And of course, when activists say, "Oh no, I'd like to know a little bit more about your linguistics," he'd say, "No, that's not really of any interest to you." So they've always been discouraged from it. And equally, the folk who have been kind of using his linguistics, they've known that he is a left winger, and on the other hand, they've sort of thought, well, that doesn't really matter. I mean, they're mostly fairly far on the right, the people who've used his linguistics. So perhaps I should explain his.
Before we do, we'll come on to his linguistics because so few people. I mean, I was saying before we start recording, I had to study it for English at A level. Let me just give you an example that you brought up in an article you've written about Noam Chomsky and the Epstein scandal. Because you talk about his associations, past associations, and one of them was John Deutsch, who is a scientist at MIT, of course, where, as you say, Noam Chomsky is based, who played a leading role in the Pentagon's nuclear and chemical weapons strategy, then became deputy defense secretary, and then became director of the CIA, which is obviously at the absolute epicenter of the military-industrial complex that Noam Chomsky is known for battling against. And Noam Chomsky then, as you said, surely judged him harshly, but in various interviews, he said Deutsch was a friend who has more honesty and integrity than anyone I've ever met in academic life or any other life. If somebody's got to be running the CIA, I'm glad it's him. So I guess, because Noam Chomsky, by definition, by working at MIT, will associate with those sorts of people, as you say. So MIT integrates into that military-industrial complex. So inevitably became friends with them. But a lot of people would go, well, you can't separate the personal and the political. And I guess that is a kind of foreshadow of this, maybe.
I think he was well used to finding positives in people whom he regarded as criminals. Because a very large number of the people he was working with, he did regard as essentially war criminals. And yet, of course, you've got to survive. You've got to make it, you've got to get on it in your place of work. You don't want too many, conflicts. And so he's kind of used to doing that. So that's one of the points I want to make. I'm not saying that explains what happened. I can't really say that explains his association with Epstein. But I'm saying it sort of possibly makes you realize the extent to which he was used to doing that kind of thing, seeing all sorts of positives in people he knew to be criminals and he himself considered to be criminals. I mean, you've got to get on with these people. And then when Epstein started kind of seducing him, taking advantage of his vulnerabilities, taking advantage of his personal needs for advice and financial help and, all of that, which we now know about, It just meant that he could do it. Many of us wouldn't have been able to do that, but no one was used to it.
Could you just tell us, so for someone who doesn't know anything about linguistics, so imagine they've come completely blind to the whole subject, how would you kind of, as pithily as possible, I guess, how would you explain his linguistic theory?
Your mind and mine is a digital computer. That's the essence of it. So he was, as an anthropologist, of course, when I'm aware that when you go to a strange place and you're in some distant tribe and some shaman is making sounds and talking what on the surface seems to be complete and utter nonsense, you're not allowed to just dismiss it as nonsense. You have to think, okay, clearly in the culture concerned, in the communities involved with, this person is saying things which have an immense meaning. That's why people listen to him. And so I was interested. Okay, what was the tribe from which Chomsky emanated? And I realized it was this strange tribe, really, of relatively young white men, very excited by the prospect of digital computing. It was the beginning of the computer age. And for Chomsky, it was an incredible opportunity to intervene. The way he did it was by arguing that the mind itself is a digital computer, and language is something you can understand as a natural scientist, like a computer scientist. So he was anxious to describe language as a mechanism, really. Let me just give you an example. What he needed to do was to detach linguistics from social anthropology, cultural anthropology, sociology, social science of any kind, by eliminating any notion of learning, of self-awareness, of communication even. So he described language exactly as if it was one of those computers they were just beginning to design, and a massive frame computer which didn't talk to anyone else, but you had information going in and into the complex mechanism of the computer, and then you have an output. So he describes language as cognition, or computation rather. It's a computational theory of mind. So a child doesn't learn language. What it has is all the world's possible languages, including past languages, already installed, and then when the child begins to hear sounds from the ambient language, the language it's born into, it runs through all the languages already installed in its brain. And finally, if it's in England, it thinks, oh, must be in England, must be English. Oh, I know English, I've got it. And it runs through all the pre-installed languages in its head, and thinks, and then comes out with, oh, I've got it. It's English. I know that one, and it can begin to sort of pick up the sounds, and eventually, of course, within a year or two, come out with some output. But he describes all that as instantaneous. The child doesn't go through stages. It doesn't learn increasingly more phrases and compare them with others. It all happens instantaneously. And language isn't for communication. It's for thinking. So even if language emerged in an ancestral human through one single genetic mutation, it would still have enormous advantages, selectional advantages, Darwinian advantages, fitness advantages, because it would be able to think more powerfully. So I think you can see that to be told that language isn't social, it's not for communication, it's got nothing to do with culture or society or self-awareness or any of the things which make us human. It's a very, very strange view of what language is, but it was useful if the whole point of your linguistics is to help design systems of command and control over the new electronically controlled bombers, nuclear bombers, and then, of course, nuclear missiles.
Chomsky, he believes, as you said, he calls it a language acquisition device and universal grammar. I remember talking about this, as I say, when I was a teenager. So we've got this intrinsic biological capacity for language, rather than it being emerging socially. Why? So can you explain a bit more there? Why is that a kind of linguistic theory, which, because you briefly alluded to it there, which is not something which progressives, people on the left, should be comfortable with, and why it was useful for the military-industrial complex, and for why reactionary elements or those who support the state would have liked and weaponized this theory?
Well, had it been realistic, it could have been extremely useful, because what the military wanted, they wanted to be able to almost like shout at a missile during the Vietnam War, in any dialect, in any language, actually. So it could be in Russian, it could be in English, some dialect of English, and if you could kind of shout at the missile, "No, not there, you idiot! No, over there!" Just tell it where to go. Actually, on a keyboard, of course, in that period, and whatever your input was, the missile could sort of, because you've inputted universal grammar, it goes from what you're saying into the universal grammar, and then out again into a language that the missile can understand. You can see how that could have been incredibly useful. So instead of translating, he was initially employed to work on machine translation, which he wasn't particularly interested in, because he realized that you need an enormously developed system of memory for these computers like we have today, and we can now do machine translation. But he was thinking, if there's a universal code, like an underlying computer code, and I get an input in one language, I then turn it into the universal grammar, and then it goes, instead of going directly, say, from Russian to English, you go from Russian to the universal code, and then out again into English. You can see how, at least in principle, you could do machine translation in an incredibly accurate way, a very fast and efficient way. But of course, there isn't a universal code. There's this underlying computer code of all the world's languages. It's just not there. So when I say, when you were asking me why did the military find it useful, they didn't. They thought they might. They thought it might be like the Manhattan Project. It might almost be like discovering how to produce nuclear weapons, split the atoms, kind of thing. That was their sort of vision of the kind of thing Chomsky might be giving them, something absolutely spectacular in terms of weaponry. But it didn't work. And then there must have been some other reason why, even when they knew it didn't work, and perhaps would never work, somehow it sort of didn't matter. Somehow it was good to have Chomsky there at MIT anyway. And my own view on that is the military and the CIA and all those people, they would have known there's always going to be some kind of left in the United States. What would be best? A left whose leader you meet with every day, you have lunch with, you have long discussions with, or a kind of leader of some sort of the left, who you don't know quite who they are, where they are, they're out of your control, you can't keep tabs on them. I think it's fairly obvious that if there's going to be a leader of the left, in some sense, you want to know who they are, and you want to be able to talk to them, and you want to be able to sort of manage things. And in a sense, that was... Go on, yeah.
No, just to give that broader context about MIT, because a lot of people might think of MIT a bit like Imperial College London, a kind of techie scientist place. So can you just explain, the relationship between MIT and the military-industrial complex, and I guess why Chomsky ended up there in the first place?
He did it in 1955. He joined MIT, and he writes about it. Jerome Wiesner was willing to take a chance on some odd ideas that looked as if they might be intriguing. If you take a look at my early publications, they all say something about Air Force, Navy, and so on, because I was in a military lab. Now, Jerome Wiesner, that was running that department, is very proud of having made significant contributions to the US military. He actually is very proud of the fact that, in his own words, I helped get the United States ballistic missile program established in the face of strong opposition from the Air Force and the Department of Defense. And we know from Lieutenant J. Keyser, who later became head of MIT's linguistics department, he was quite explicit. He actually gives us lots of sort of sample sentences. The B-45s the bombers have arrived, and the B-58 nuclear armed bombers have arrived. There's, I don't know, a whole lot of sample sentences all about the guidance of bombers. So there's absolutely no question that was what was going on. Chomsky says there was no military work actually done at MIT on the campus. Well, initially there was. When he first arrived, there was lots of direct military work was done, not in terms of designing these command and control systems, but when the missile labs were removed for kind of political reasons because of the student protests, Chomsky was still able to say there's no military work done on campus, but he himself would admit, but 4 inches off campus, lots of military work is done, because they just drew a line around what they described as on campus and off campus. And anyway, the kind of rolling up your sleeves and turning theory into practice in terms of these missile guidance systems, that was done in the buildings of a thing called the MITRE Corporation. But Chomsky had was receiving consultation fees for quite frequently, as far as we can work out, visiting the MITRE Corporation. And I wrote, Chomsky had 12 of his students working for the MITRE Corporation. That's the implementation of the theory. I wrote to Barbara Party, one of his students, and she explained to me, we were told that in the event of a nuclear war, all the generals would be underground in some safe dungeon, and it would be easier to teach the computers to understand English than teach the generals to understand computing. And so that's what their job was to do, to actually work on teaching the computer to do things, and then the generals would only need to kind of chat with, I think, on a keyboard at that stage, not actually with the voice, but the generals would just need to talk to the computers, and the computers would then guide the missiles. So and their work is again and again and again in all the technical documents, and I've got them on my website. They're in them, many of them in my book. That was the work being done. That was why the military were employing Chomsky at that relatively early stage. So there's no getting around it. Chomsky was working on missile command and control, but not very successfully, because the method he was thinking of, which would be absolutely brilliant had it worked, it didn't work, because there's no such thing as this universal grammar. There's certain kind of principles of all languages, or all of them have what Chomsky calls merge. In other words, you have different words and you merge, and there's, when you combine a few lexical items, you end up with more than you started with, because combination is more than the individual parts. I mean, obviously that's true, and there's certain things about languages. All languages have a digital component, for example, which just yeah.
So, I mean, Noam Chomsky, he said, because I know he responded, he was very upset about your analysis over the last few years. And he said that the claim that his scientific work had any relationship to military applications was false, that it was a misrepresentation and reckless. So, I mean, he was very forceful in denying that his work was used in that way.
Yes, it is August the 30th, 2018. I just working on a book called The Responsibility of Intellectuals, a reprint in a way of his earlier article, very famous article, of course. And he said, my chapter in that book, he said, is a web of deceit and misinformation. What is striking is the unfailing regularity with which Knight's vulgar exercises of defamation crash to the ground on a moment's inquiry. Meanwhile, I apologize for wasting time and space on this performance. So, I mean, yes, his main argument against my book is that there was no weapons research done on the campus at MIT.
Mm.
And as I say, this was just a strange, you know, illustration of playing around with words. I mean, obviously, you can define the word campus and say the campus is here, that 4 inches away. It's off campus, and so it's okay. But I mean, it's really is it's not convincing. Everyone knows that he was employed to work for the military, and I've got so much detail, and you know.
What about the fact that, look, in terms of his influence, Noam Chomsky's understanding of how the military works was partly informed by the fact he was at MIT. So he got an insights which were then communicated to millions and millions of people and helped politicize people. So the fact he was able to have kind of insider insights, you could argue, was quite useful in politicizing generations of people, large numbers of people, to fight against that military industrial complex.
Yes, I mean, we miss Noam. There's no question that we do. He was, for many, many, many decades, one of the very few authoritative voices of sanity in an increasingly deranged world. There's no doubt about that. And of course, Chomsky had a conscience. I would actually describe him as, in many ways, the conscience of America, insofar as the United States has a conscience. Noam was it. So early on, in the I think it was 1966, sometime like that, he was on the verge of resigning from MIT owing to its heavy involvement in designing weapons for the carpet bombing of North Vietnam. Very bravely, he visited North Vietnam under the bombing to express his solidarity. So there's no doubt that Chomsky had an enormously vibrant, sensitive, anti-militarist conscience. So in a sense, the more the more he became immersed in military work, the more powerfully he had to either resign from MIT or at least make absolutely clear his hostility to the whole military establishment, which of course he did when during the Vietnam War, the encircling of the Pentagon, him getting arrested, and all that. So I think the more he was horrified at what his colleagues were actually doing, the more his conscience prompted him to do everything possible to both to signal his opposition and to contribute to the resistance, including supporting the students at MIT who were trying to occupy some of the buildings and leaflet some of the classes, for which they got arrested, of course, and in some cases imprisoned. But of course, Chomsky had decided not to resign, and is only so far he could go in supporting the students. And as I've explained in the book, at the end of the day, when the students were trying to occupy the principal's office, it was Chomsky who was on the other side, pushing the other way and trying to prevent those students. So he was always completely in the middle, absolutely, stuck in the middle between two tectonic plates almost. The U.S. military and all those opposed to the U.S. military. Just an incredibly complex, difficult dilemma for him, which he managed brilliantly. He's extraordinary, kind of Machiavellian intelligence. But I want you to see how if at lunchtime he's talking with a future director of the CIA, whom he regarded as you say, as a friend, and then in the evening he's off to a meeting of anarchists and anti-militarists, you can see why at that evening meeting of activists, he doesn't want the director of the CIA just coming in and sort of saying, "Oh, hello, folks, it's nice to be with you all." And equally, when he's talking to the future director of the CIA, he doesn't want the student activists to be joining the conversation. So he's going to switch between two completely different, linguistic codes. So two completely separate parts of his brain have to be switched on and then switched off to avoid contamination. And the real tragedy for Noam now, obviously he's suffered this terrible, debilitating stroke. But the real tragedy is that all of us can now see the double life. All of us can now see the two opposed version of Noam Chomsky, and that is destruction. I mean, that is kind of destroys a man. But if you're asking about whether we should still read his political writings on the Middle East and all this absolutely brilliantly honest and incisive writings, obviously, yes, as you say, no one could have no one could have written that stuff. He wasn't an insider. It's only an insider within the U.S. military-industrial complex, somebody who's part of that complex, in a way, part of those crimes. Only somebody with that information, insider information, could have been so authoritative, so kind of relaxed, convincing about what he was saying. He wasn't just some activist, with a sort of megaphone on some street corner shouting out his views on things. He was an insider with knowledge which no one could have had there not been an insider, and that's why he was so powerful. But obviously, for both sides of that double life to suddenly become public is the worst possible outcome.
And just finally on that, because, I'm not going to say Noam Chomsky politicized me. I mean, you actually knew my parents before I was born. I'm from a political family. But nonetheless, Noam Chomsky, look, I was, I'm a geriatric millennial, as we're known in my particular generation. I'm 41 years old. And in the 1990s, I grew up in the age of, I guess, there is no alternative, the kind of suffocating post-Cold War sense of, someone summed it up at the time, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So it's this kind of a totally suffocating kind of capitalist triumphalism. And there were very few kind of lifeboats, as I would put it, life rafts around. Later on we got Naomi Klein, who emerged through the rise of what was called the anti-globalization, anti-capitalist movement of the late 90s, which then obviously we ended up with the war on terror. But Noam Chomsky was basically almost it at the time. He was the last leftist major public intellectual left standing, with a mass audience. But I mean, it's difficult. So I'm just wondering, is anything salvageable, really? Because I mean, for me, I think the fact is, because if I look at the apology written by his partner, who says, we were careless in not thoroughly researching his background. This was a grave mistake. And for that lapse in judgment, I apologize on behalf of us. Noam shared with me before his stroke that he felt the same way. It was deeply disturbing for both of us to realize we had engaged with someone who presented as a helpful friend but led a hidden life of criminal, inhumane, and perverted acts. She asked for, in terms of his advice to Epstein and rehabilitating his image in 2019. Epstein had claimed to Noam that Epstein was being unfairly persecuted, and Noam spoke from his own experience of political controversies within the media. Epstein created a manipulative narrative about his case, which Noam in good faith believed in. It is now clear it was all orchestrated, having as at least one of Epstein's intentions to try and have someone like Noam repairing Epstein's reputation by association. He says his criticism was never directed at the women's movement, but rather about cancelling culture. I guess the difficulty a lot of people have is, notwithstanding the fact that Noam Chomsky, before his stroke even, was an elderly man in his 90s. I have interviewed in his 90s. He had a sharp mind up until his stroke. He's a thoroughly, he's a forensic researcher, and there was more than enough information about Jeffrey Epstein in the public domain. I mean, I've been, attacking the government for the fact that, Keir Starmer saying, well, I was lied to. I thought Peter Mandelson said he barely knew him. It's like, just use Google. you can find it very quickly that, that his associate, you can find it very quickly about Jeffrey Epstein. And the fact that in 2008 he was convicted for soliciting sex with a minor. I mean, it's just, so, I mean, it's just hard to see, isn't it? Hard to see how that is ever forgivable. I can't forgive it.
It's unforgivable. No doubt about it. I've never had a one-sided view of Noam Chomsky. I've always known there were two versions of Noam, of Chomsky. And one of the critical things is, and this is not about morality exactly now, but it's just that the CIA, and in a way NATO, were interested not just in military opposition to the Soviet Union, but in ideological opposition. And Noam Chomsky's concept of a language organ, like a particular little computer inside the brain, which is responsible for everything which makes us human in a way. Certainly, it's a language organ. That led to this complete reversal, turning upside down of Marxism and materialism, any kind of sociological materialism, because it led to the idea of the modular mind with all these little funny little miniature computers inside the brain. And what drives history, what makes change, is one module or another module getting switched on or off. So you have a cheat detection module, you have a face recognition module. In my field in anthropology, if a shaman travels up to the stars, moves around from one star to another, and comes back again, it's because of a astral travel module in the head. So I mean, this is a insanely idealist version of mind before matter, mind over matter. Ideas come first, modules come first. So, to me, the reason for being so interested in Noam is to understand all that. In a certain sense, a benefit is that all that kind of has to be, has now collapsed. But as you say, is there anything salvageable? I would say very strongly, actually, in terms of the analysis of political, conflicts, the different sort of tectonic plates of the world as it is today. You'll always gain by reading Chomsky. I think that's you can't deny that. But it doesn't alter the fact that particularly his attacks on Me Too, for example, calling those women hysterical. I mean, what a word to use! Women have got wombs. I mean, he couldn't have used worse language. And this is the problem, of course, is that he would put things in one way to Epstein, and then another way, as Valeria does in that letter, to try and excuse her as well as Noam, in a completely different way. Noam's always supported the women's movement. Well, actually, to be honest, Noam's always been extremely limited when it's come to gender. When it comes to gender, he's been very, very lacking in gender awareness. And of course, nuclear missiles, computers, these different modules, they don't. You don't need gender when you're looking at computers. They don't really have gender, and it's a very serious weakness in all of Chomsky's work, a kind of gender blindness right through his whole life. To be honest, obviously he's tried to sort of keep up, more or less sort of claim to be on the side of women among activists. There's no sign of that in any of his writing, actually, and certainly in any of his other work.
Devastating stuff, and as we said, unforgivable. But such a fascinating insight into, I guess, the broader context for a lot of people who are just, I guess, completely shocked about someone who they saw as having a huge amount of moral integrity, how they could possibly end up in this situation. For those watching, please like, subscribe, leave your thoughts, your comments, share the video. But Chris, what a pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.